At the end of the Second World War, many Nazi war criminals were arrested and were brought then to trials to stand to answer charges they found themselves accused of. There were more, however, who were never brought to trial, but one of the most notorious prisons inside of Germany became a site of execution, which was used to carry out the executions and death sentences of many Nazi war criminals. It was within the walls of Landsberg Prison, where Adolf Hitler was even held following his attempts to take power inside of Munich and Germany during the Munich Putsch. But it was a place where Hitler was treated with a great degree of leniency, when he could have easily gone to the gallows for his crimes of treason. But after the conflict that he caused, his former prison became one of the most consistent and prolific execution sites inside of Germany, where a number of SS guards and former members of the Nazi Party, and also murderers, were taken on the short walk to the gallows. Welcome to The Untold Past. Today we look at the Gallows of Landsberg Prison. As always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Landsberg Prison was constructed at the start of the 20th century, and it took 3 years to build, with work being finished in 1908. However, it was a place which would hold over 500 prisoners, but then it was used for what was regarded as fortress imprisonment at the end of the First World War. Prisoners were given a significant degree of comfort behind the walls of the prison, and they had a rather easy experience when compared with others. This was what Hitler experienced when he was held behind Landsberg's bars, as he was allowed many visitors, and he was even allowed to create and write his autobiography Mein Kampf. But when Hitler took control in the following decades, he would transition Landsberg from being a comfortable place of incarceration to an incredibly feared Nazi fortress. There were many victims who found themselves sent there before they were moved to concentration camps, and these were often considered political prisoners. However, also inside of Landsberg, there were a number of SS doctors who conducted experiments upon those behind bars. In 1943, one prisoner, named Alfred Baker, stated of his treatment inside the prison that, "Firstly, I am scarred for life, lower left jaw, owing to the fact that I was run down, lost weight to 52 kilos, and they had to operate on me. That was at Landsberg, Lech, Germany, at the foot of some mountains. The doctor said to me, 'I can't give you more food as you are my enemy.' The day after the operation, I had to go straight to work, forced labour. I also had an abscess in my ear a little time after the operation. On entering Buchenwald horror camp, I was kicked to hell by a big Nazi after." Different levels of prisoners received different conditions during the Second World War, and they had to conduct work in the site and work in the kitchens, but some of the guards were known for their violent treatment of the inmates. As the war turned against the Germans, the punishment inside of the prison did get worse, and there were at least 210 people who died inside the prison, many of whom were starved to death, and some were tortured to death and even executed by the guards. But the bloodshed and death would continue at the end of the war, as the prison then became a site under the control of the American Army, and there were hundreds of US military policemen brought in to guard the camp. And there were hundreds of US military policemen brought in to guard Landsberg, as well as prisoners who ended up there. But Landsberg was referred to as War Criminal Prison No. 1, and there were hundreds of former Nazis and concentration camp guards who were locked up there. At the end of the conflict, there were hunts for those war criminals who had committed crimes against people inside the concentration camps, and the Allies also looked for people who had committed crimes against Allied soldiers. With this, many German civilians who had supported the Nazis found themselves accused of murdering Allied servicemen, and some were executed inside of Landsberg for this. Those who were arrested and were brought to trial faced possible execution, which occurred inside different prisons, such as Hamlin, but Landsberg was the main site where those who were condemned by American military courts were then executed. Between 1945 and 1946, there were 110 prisoners who were convicted of various war crimes trials, and many more were held following the Dachau trials, which punished those guards and members of staff who worked at the first concentration camp. There were international prisoners also there, as a few following being sentenced after the Shanghai trials were held at Landsberg. But almost 300 people would lose their lives in over 5 years in Landsberg, and there were a number who were executed in different ways at the site. The most common method was the gallows and hanging, which could be found inside one of the prison's courtyards, and there were 259 executions that were carried out in this manner. There were also 29 executions performed by firing squads, but the execution using the gallows was more numerous and preferred by the American authorities. Firing squad was allowed for those who were considered prominent soldiers, but the gallows was a large structure found inside the courtyard for war criminals. The executions using this wooden execution structure would be performed in the very same, yet efficient, swift manner. The condemned was kept inside of their prison cell until the executioner was literally ready for them. They were usually told a few hours before their execution would be performed that they were due to die. Executions were not carried out immediately after the issuing of the death sentence by the courts, as pleas for clemency and also other appeals would then be lodged. But when these were rejected, executions would be performed roughly around a year after the initial death sentence was passed. After being told it was time for their executions, the condemned were then taken by American military policemen and a priest who guided them towards the gallows. The priest was there to administer final blessings and also hold a final mass if it was required, but he also heard the final words of the condemned. But there were 2 gallows within the courtyard of Landsberg Prison, and usually there were a number of people executed on the same day, and these gallows would be used simultaneously to ensure that the executions were done quickly and efficiently. The guards would then stand aside and watch the executions, and their job was to check the identity of the Nazi who was being executed, and they then passed him over to the executioner. But whilst they were on the scaffold, the American executioner then ensured that the arms and legs of the condemned were secured together to ensure no problems when they fell through the trapdoor. A photographer would usually take a final photograph, with the condemned stood over where they would seconds later be sent through. The executioner held the noose to the side, and he then took the condemned and placed a black cap over their head, before he finally secured the noose around their necks. But once the prisoner was then stood in the centre of the trap, they would be then sent crashing through it as the executioner pushed the lever. The bodies of these were then put in a coffin after death was confirmed, and they were then cut down. These were then given back to the families unless they were not claimed. If this was the case, then they would be interred inside of a cemetery close to the prison chapel. But whilst at Landsberg Prison, there were a number of executioners who worked there, including the American John C. Woods, the botching executioner of Nuremberg, and it's believed he may have also carried out some badly performed executions whilst he was at Landsberg. Those who were executed here include Karl Brandt, the former personal doctor of Adolf Hitler, and also Karl Gebhardt, the former personal doctor of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. The final executions of Landsberg Prison occurred on the 7th of June 1951, and then a number of the prisoners who were still held there were released from prison. In 1958, the Americans gave over control of Landsberg to the German authorities, and the final 4 prisoners were released. Throughout its time in operation as an American-controlled prison, there were roughly 300 war criminals who were executed within Landsberg, and most of the executions were carried out on the gallows. But it was on the scaffold where some of the most infamous Nazis of the Second World War lost their lives, and Landsberg was a place which even held the dictator Adolf Hitler years before the Second World War he caused broke out. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.